Has it ever been so bad that you had to ask to speak with a manager? Usually that's not a good sign if somebody asks for the manager. Sometimes if I'm in a restaurant or an organization and there's somebody who's just doing a really good job or somebody who's helping me on the phone and they're just exceptional, I'll say, "Can I please speak with your manager?" And they always go, "Okay, yep, yeah, I'll get him, just a minute." And usually that's a bad sign, right? But in those exceptional moments, I just love to get somebody going, "What'd they do?" And the manager usually comes out defensive like, "All right, how can I help? Your employee was just rocking it today. They were great." Whoa, I mean, it takes a while to sink in. This is actually what's happening, but that usually doesn't happen. Usually when we call for a higher up, it means that we need correction at the lower level, right? Now, it's a hard move to make if you're in your job and you've got to talk to your boss's boss about your boss. Some of you who don't like conflict, you'd rather just quit the job and go to another company than go up the ladder like that. And we usually don't do it flippantly, but sometimes there are situations where the person in charge needs some correction. And so there's always somebody higher to go to. One of my favorite go-to movies right now is Infinity Wars, the Avengers, the one of the newest Avengers movies. Now, I have not seen the newest Avenger movie, Endgame. It's been out on theaters, so I'm serious. I don't want to know what happens. Don't tell me. So if this analogy breaks down by the second movie, I don't care. I don't want to know. Let me be surprised. But there's something particularly disturbing about Infinity War. If you've seen the movie, and it's unusually unsettling because we've learned for movie after movie, for the last decade, we've learned to put our trust in these heroes who have superhuman ability. We've learned by example that no matter what foe we face, Thor has this superhuman godlike power and he can eventually win. We've learned to trust Iron Man and all of the things that he can invent and do. And when you put these guys together, they just form a really incredible superhero team. The thing that's so unsettling about Infinity War is one bad guy has more power than all of the heroes put together. We finally meet a villain who seems to be the most powerful person in the universe, and he's bad. And Thanos just destroys everybody else. It's not even hardly a competition between the power of the highest level boss in the universe. And what's so unsettling about this, you always feel that there's some higher source of appeal that you can call to in times like that, but in this universe there isn't. He's the highest and the worst. If there are any things like higher powers in this universe, it's these crystals, it's these elemental stones that don't really have personality and they don't have morality and they are in no way ability to receive your appeal and to correct. They don't do that. They're not personal. They're just powerful. I know sometimes you feel like you live in that universe. There are some times in your life where you feel like the person who is in authority over you is not correctable. There's nobody stepping in. They're getting away with murder and you can't find out how to appeal to get it fixed. But let me just tell you, you do not live in that universe. That is not where you live. You live in a universe where there is always somebody who's in charge and he is good. And even if it seems like the person in authority is wreaking havoc and not being put in check, that's not the universe that you live in. God is still in charge. Last week we kicked off this series of Exile, and we talked about the uneasiness that is rumbling below the surface in society. If you're here, you heard me share some statistics about how many people in our nation are self-considered Christians and how many people actually go to church, which is a pretty high number, and how that number has been pretty consistent over the last 75 years. But still there is a drifting uneasiness happening that's hard to describe. We've called it exile. It's not the same thing as being persecuted for your faith. It's not the same thing as being imprisoned. It's not the same thing as being hampered in worship. It's the marginalization of the Christian voice. It's where somebody is just taking the microphone of the church and turning down the volume. You still have a voice, but it's just not important anymore. You are assimilated into a sea of opinions. I drew 5 areas or domains of society on the board last week that involve this drift. One is family, one is government, one is education or schools, one is culture, especially driven by philosophy and art, and one is the church. All 5 of these are part of what makes up society. In exile, what happens is the society at large only sees God as having authority in the church. Society does not acknowledge God's authority over family, over government. He doesn't necessarily have say in what culture does or in what is taught. Yeah, fine, church, you go let God help you do your liturgy and your catechisms and baptize them in the name of God on Sunday mornings. And you can do that stuff on the weekends. But meanwhile, we'll deal with the real stuff. Let the big boys play in the arena of military funding and reproductive rights and standardized testing. God really doesn't have a whole lot of overlap in some of those areas. Let us define what kind of family we want to have. Let us decide what kind of media we want to produce. Let the filmmakers rule the minds of the culture. In exile, the voice becomes unheard. Daniel is a great example of what happens when people who used to have a dominant voice now are pushed to the margins and don't know what to do with themselves. The older you are, the more drift you have seen. Let's jump into Daniel. I want to key in on one of the famous stories of Daniel. Daniel's just full of exciting stories. Today, we're looking primarily at Daniel chapter 6. You heard James read so much of it really well. Before we get to the part of chapter 6, there's a little bit of background that's really important. Nebuchadnezzar was the king that Daniel was originally serving. And there were some big changes in Nebuchadnezzar's life, according to the book of Daniel. We realized some dramatic insights that came to the king Nebuchadnezzar over the kingdom of Babylon, one of the greatest kingdoms of its time, one of the greatest kings on earth at that time. And he had a pretty significant heart change. He initially was taking over Jerusalem just like any other city. It did not matter to him what gods resided there. There were gods that resided everywhere. He didn't really honor or respect most of them. And so when he stole things from the temple, he took gold, he took the goblets, he took things from the city. That was just all part of the cart back to Babylon, part of his building program. He had no regard for a local little god the Jews called Yahweh, no regard, until the fiery furnace incident. You remember that story? There was a key moment that changed his life forever, and he came to this realization that the God of Daniel, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that God is actually the God. He described him in very cosmic terms over all. When he had that realization, he had a change of heart, and he actually made it pretty clear to everyone else, hey, this God needs to be known. This is the King of heaven. A few years passed, and he reverted. the book of Daniel says that Nebuchadnezzar was walking through his kingdom and he was looking at all of the amazing things that he had done and all of the wonderful buildings that he had constructed and basically just the incredible life that he had cultivated for himself and his kingdom. And he said to himself, am I not awesome? I mean, that's my paraphrase. That's not exactly what he said. Is this not amazing? Look what I have done. Wow, these people are lucky to have me as their king. And in that moment, when his heart turned toward glorifying himself and forgetting God, God reminded him of who he was. He struck him with that situation you heard about, just read. There's actually a psychological term for this that's still used today for what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, he's one of the leading cases of it. It's very rare. It's a very unusual psychological disease called boanthropy. And when people have this psychological disease called boanthropy, it's one of the weird ones. There are some strange ones, but this is one of the more strange ones. People actually begin to think of themselves and believe that they are an ox or a cattle or a cow. And so they will begin to live like a cow. Real people living outside on their knees, walking and you can, if you just looked around, you'd realize ergonomically we're not built like cows. It doesn't work. And we don't have enough stomachs to chew the cud, but they will be on all fours. They will eat the grass. They will moo. 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar, look at this position here, was humbled by God. He was brought low until he realized where his real position was. And then God restored him back to his kingdom. At the end of all of these events, Nebuchadnezzar writes a letter. It's apparently circulated and well enough known in the kingdom that generations later they would know it. And in this letter, he talks about his whole story. He talks about his insight and revelation of who God is. He talks about living in exile himself as a cattle. He talks about the Lord. And he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, last verse of chapter 5. He says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, now glorify, praise, and honor the King of heaven. All the things that he does, all his acts are just and true. He is able to humble the proud. End of chapter 5. Start of chapter 6. We're introduced to a new king, Belshazzar. Probably several decades later, he calls him his son, but it could have meant his successor. Probably, scholars think, maybe 20 years later, even after Nebuchadnezzar. So now Belshazzar is on the throne. He is really enjoying his power, and he's throwing a party. Probably not the only time he threw a party, but this time he was throwing a really big party, 1,000 people there. Can you imagine the cleanup? I mean, if you've had a house party, it's a mess. So he's got all of his important people there. He's got his wives. He's got his concubines. He's got everybody that's anybody is at this party. And some scholars think it was kind of a drunken orgy. It was just ridiculous. And so he, in the middle of probably being tipsy, calls in the golden goblets. He calls in the cups from Jerusalem. Hey, go get those golden cups that Nebuchadnezzar brought from Jerusalem, from the temple. Bring those in. We're going to use them to drink with. Now, even an unreligious person or even a Babylonian would not do this in their right mind. They wouldn't pull a sacred artifact from somebody else's God's temple into a party like this. It was just uncouth. Like, it'd be worse than the youth pastor throwing a kegger after a youth event with all the kids. I mean, it'd be worse than taking the pages of your Bible and ripping them out and using them as toilet paper. It was just blasphemous. He brought the cups that were used in the temple and he drank with them, and God said, so in his party, in the middle of his party, something happens, and a huge hand comes out of nowhere, and on the wall it writes, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And it says that, well, the NIV is kind of a tame translation. It says that Belshazzar's knees trembled and he summoned his astrologers. A more dramatic translation may say he was so terrified he pooped his pants and screamed for his sorcerers. And that's sort of what the text infers. If you're the king and the situation is code red, you send for your soldiers. When the situation becomes code brown, you summon your sorcerers. That's exactly what he did. He realized there is something more happening here than I am able to deal with militarily. Get the people in here who know about the divine stuff. They didn't know what to do with this thing. They didn't know what it meant. It's not like they couldn't read it. They could read it. It was in Aramaic. They could know the words. They just didn't know what it meant. So everybody's terrified. In the residual memory of the culture, there was a vicissitude of God's presence. There was the queen, probably not Belshazzar's queen, probably an older queen, probably somebody from a previous era who came in that moment of fear and indecision, that moment of unknown, and came up to Belshazzar and she said, listen, there's a guy. There's a guy. I remember this guy. He does stuff like this. He's done it before. The spirit of the gods are on him. His name is Daniel. You need to find this Daniel. Notice, Belshazzar did not know Daniel. Okay, go get him. They brought Daniel in. And Daniel sees it, and God gives him the interpretation, and God gives him the message. He becomes the prophetic voice in Babylon to the king, and he said, gosh, I hate to tell you this, but let me tell you what happened in Nebuchadnezzar. And he told him the story. And he says, and this is happening to you. Let me tell you what this means. Numbered, weighed, divided. King, this is what God is saying to you. It's not iffy. The writing's already on the wall. Do you ever wonder where that phrase came from? That's where it means it's a done deal. God, the God of heaven, has numbered the days of your rule. He's weighed you on the scales of justice and has found you wanting, and he's taken your kingdom from you and divided it between the Medes and the Persians. This was not good news for Belshazzar, but he honored the messenger and he made Daniel third highest in the kingdom. His dad was the highest. He was co-ruling, so he was second. Daniel was the third position, now the highest position he could offer in the kingdom. Daniel got promoted from obscurity back into power through this move. That same night, Belshazzar was killed. Here's some things, 3 things I think we can really glean from Daniel's experience. The first one is this: God is in charge. God is in charge. This is actually the main point. The other 2 are just sub-points. I want to read to you a few verses from Daniel chapter 1 and then a couple other ones. Because Daniel, at the very beginning of the book, it makes it very clear that God is the actor here. He is the sovereign power. He is the one who gives. I want to notice all of the places that it says God gives. Let's pull up these slides. These are some specific things so that we don't misunderstand the story of what God is doing. God gave the king of Judah over to Nebuchadnezzar. That wasn't just a better military victory. God gave. God gave Daniel and his friends favor among the chief officials. It wasn't just because they were handsome or smart. God was at work. God gave Daniel and his friends knowledge and understanding. They weren't the brightest of the bunch naturally. There was a supernatural element to him being able to interpret this stuff. God gave Daniel the interpretation of dreams. God gave Nebuchadnezzar dominion, power, might, and glory. Next one. This is chapter 4. I raised my eyes toward heaven and my sanity was restored. I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. All the peoples of the earth he regards as nothing. He does whatever he wants. Doesn't that sound like a Psalm of David? Guess who that is? Nebuchadnezzar. The guy who took stuff from the temple and had no regard, thought he was in charge of everything. God, in this situation where it seems like all is lost, people are carted away into exile, all these foreign gods are being worshipped, nobody really knows Yahweh and nobody really cares, the Jews are scattered, the temple worship is not functioning like normal. God is in charge. Here are a few more verses. Let's go to the next one. This is from the New Testament, but this is where we make the bridge and begin to apply it to you. Jesus came and told his disciples, Matthew 28, I have been given all what? All authority in heaven and on earth. Ephesians 1, Paul says this, God has put all things under the authority of Christ and has made him head over all things for the benefit of the what? Colossians 2:10. So you are made complete through your union with Christ. You are united with Christ, who is the head over every ruler and authority. Let me ask you a couple questions. Is Jesus in charge of your boss at work? Is Jesus in charge of your company? Is Jesus in charge of your mom and dad? Is Jesus in charge of your marriage? Is Jesus in charge of your president? Is Jesus in charge of your governor? Is Jesus in charge of a foreign dictator who's treating his people extremely harshly? Is Jesus in charge of your cancer? Is he in charge of your health condition? Is he in charge of your finances? Is he in charge of your sin condition? See, the question is not if he's in charge. The question really is, to what degree do we live as if he's in charge? In all of the domains where people have stopped recognizing God's authority, doesn't mean he's not in charge. Just means to what degree do we recognize his authority? If you are going to live a gospel-centered life in Babylon, if you're going to live a Christian life true to Christ in exile, where the authority of Christ no longer extends to every place in the minds of the people, you're going to have to butt up against something that is uncomfortable. But see, the knee-jerk reaction for us, if we let that sink in, is, well, if God is in charge of government, why are things happening that seem so off and ungodly? If God is in charge of my school system, why do people act in such a way as they do? If God's in charge of my boss, why do they get away with whatever she wants to do? She seems to do it and nobody calls her to account. If God's in charge of my health, then why is it declining? We butt up against the uncomfortable reality of God's mysterious sovereignty. If you want to live a gospel-centered life in Babylon, you have to be familiar with the uncomfortable reality of God's mysterious sovereignty. It means he's in charge, and he lets strange things happen to our ears. He lets Nebuchadnezzar, of all people, have power, glory, and dominion. Why would he do that? He lets people like Belshazzar rule for years. Why would he do that? Before I went to seminary, I decided to go to Africa for a little bit. I was going to spend several months there as a missionary. I figured it'd be a good grounding in reality before hitting seminary. I was going through an organization that I requested to go to Kenya, and so they were sending me to Kenya, and I was going to work with a church network in Kenya, and I was really excited about this. Never been to Africa, but I was going for the first time. And so I had planned and began to research and study Kenya and had the location set out. And then as we got closer, like a month away from going, the organization called and said, well, the pastoral director there in Kenya, well, we had other volunteers come back, and we're sorry to tell you he's sort of corrupt. He's treated them poorly. We just don't trust him. He's not handling things leadership-wise well. He's abusing financial situations. He's just corrupt. We can't send you there. So we're going to send you to another country. You're going to Uganda. I said, fine, I'm flexible. I don't have a choice. I have to be flexible. I can't go there anyway. So I was going to Uganda to live in a town called Mukono and work with a church organization in Mukono. But I tell you, in the travel, they moved me to a different town. And I got picked up at the airport, and I'm driving with these individuals that I'd never met. And, it's like literally you just can't be a backseat driver. Here are these people that are taking me to a place I don't know where I'm going, in a country that I wasn't even supposed to be in a town that they just moved, and dropped me off at this random location that I had never seen, this little hotel complex called Arise Africa, and you just sort of are along for the ride. I mean, I've got to do what I don't know any better. These are the people in charge. And they dropped me off this hotel complex, and one of the first people I meet is named Esther. And we got married. I don't know how you'd want to say it or how you think about it. Does that make the other director's corruption valid? Does it make it all worth it? I don't know. You can't really say that. Does it mean that I shouldn't have gone to Kenya? I'm glad I didn't. I don't know. I just know that I love my wife. And all that stuff that happened, whatever hotel they dropped me off to, whatever town was moved, somehow good really came out of that. And this is what I'm telling you. I don't know the circumstances, and I know there seems to be places where you're just a backseat driver. You can't get your hand on the steering wheel. What in the world is God doing? Why are things changing? You may not see any redemption in the story, but I'm telling you, he is good, and he's in charge, and you're united with Jesus, and he's working things out for the benefit of his bride. Hang in there. Charles Spurgeon said, when we face difficulties, sovereignty is the pillow on which we lay our heads. Second one is this. God's in charge, which means he holds all human leaders accountable for how they use their authority. He did it to Nebuchadnezzar. Boanthropy, you're a cow. That's sort of humiliating, but it was better than what happened to Belshazzar. He holds, even if it takes a while, and it's not in our timeline, and it's not in our methodology, God does not turn a blind eye to how people use their God-given authority in every domain, not just in the church. It's horrible when people abuse in the church, but in family, in government, in school systems, at your job. And there's reasons, folks, there's reasons for having child protective services in society. Those are good things, and having 3 branches of government, not just one autonomous dictator. There's reasons for having boards of directors. All those things are good, because when we find ourselves in a place of injustice and there's a person in authority, we're meant to appeal to those things. Those are good institutional checks and balances to help bring correction. But what I'm telling you is there will be times in your life, like I need to tell you this, there's times in your life where you can't get it made right. When it seems like the authority is doing whatever they want and you can't get the check and balance to work, right? Does that ever happen? Or if it's happening, it's not happening quick enough. You can have hope because God's in charge. And he will deal. Here's the third one. The first one was God's in charge. The second one is he holds people accountable. And the third one is look for invitations. Some interpreters think that when Daniel was in a really important place of power with Nebuchadnezzar, he lost all of that by the time Belshazzar came. Belshazzar didn't even know who he was. Maybe 20 years later, and Daniel is just living back in the extreme margins of a foreign society until he's called upon. Until somewhere in the residual memory of God, the culture calls for the person of God to step forward. And so Daniel steps forward. Notice he did not, from what we can tell from the text, he did not spend his 20 years fighting for back his place of power and trying to schmooze with all the new kings and make himself known and let people know what happened and why he should be at their right hand. He just faded into obscurity and came back when he was called. And he did something pretty incredible. He neither remember the two temptations of exile last week? One is we're just tempted to take control. We're tempted to get powered up and fight for that place of privilege that we used to occupy as Christians. And the other temptation is opposite of that. It's just to fully blend in and have no distinction between us and the culture. Just do whatever everyone else in exile is doing. Daniel does neither. He lives a God-centered, gospel-revolving life in exile, whether or not he's in power. And when called upon, he comes to speak a very devastating message by the power of God. He neither retreats, nor does he attack. Sometimes in exile, I think we lose our voice. We lose our prophetic voice because we're so busy shouting. Not only do we lose it here, we lose it. They just stop listening. Daniel took on the role of historian and advisor. Historian is, he told them about what happened. He told Belshazzar of how God had worked. And it was enough that he knew it. Belshazzar knew he was right. When he heard the history, he knew it. And he became advisor. Once he had set the groundwork of history, and he then set the groundwork of the future, and he became an advisor to the king and told him the way to go, how to follow God's intent. There will be invitations in places that you think are inaccessible to you in a culture that is drifting. And the trick is to be in such a posture that when those invitations come, you don't get disgusted with the culture and say, why in the world would I help a blasphemous king like that? Why in the world would I step into that meeting and give my 2 cents? Why would I help an organization that had nothing to do with Christianity? No, that's not Daniel's posture. The trick is to be ready when God moves to step into the places that he opens so you can bring the message of God to the people that he loves. Would you think of somebody in your life who has some sort of authority over you that you think is misusing that authority? Did you picture that person? Maybe there's nobody, but if you have somebody right now, picture them, and then I want you to picture God in charge of them. And take a moment, eyes closed, and pray for that person. Pray for humility and wisdom. Picture another person. Just one more. Somebody in government or somebody in your school system or your job or society who you think has authority and they're not using it for God's purposes. Picture that person. It could be a musician. It could be an actor. It could be a supervisor. And picture that person. Then picture God above them. And then just take a minute and pray for them. Pray for wisdom and humility. Take heart, church. He's still in charge. And he really is fond of you. I'd like to offer 2 questions and give you a moment to discuss and process them. This will help launch us in from what happens here into the rest of our week. First question is this, and I'm going to ask you to discuss this with somebody sitting around you for 2 or 3 minutes. First question is this: what did the Holy Spirit say to you this morning? Question number 2, what are you going to do about it this week? Can we stand together? I want to pray for you and send you into all the places that you're going to go this week. Before you go, I just want to remind you and encourage you, before you leave today, would you take one of those prayer cards if you haven't? They're on the back wall. please take one of those. You can pray for 7 days this week. You heard some of the stories. These people that we're partnering with, those are our stories. We are part of their prayer support and their financial support. 2 is on July 21st. Would you consider and prayerfully give something, even if it's $1 and you say, I don't have any money for that. Give something through that pledge card. You'll get it again. You'll get to see it again. But we are already on a running start. Our goal is $17,000 and we're already moving. And also, third is the sign-up sheets. We're doing 4 serve places. There's 12 spots each. Would you sign up for one of those before you go so that you don't miss the spot that you wanted next week? And now may the love of God, the peace of Jesus Christ, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you as you go. You are sent.